Welcome to the Bhagavata Podcast. I'm Måns Group, a senior lecturer at Åbo Akademi University in Finland and a senior research fellow at the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies. I'll be a host for this podcast inspired by the work of the Gaudiya Studies Research Project at the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies. This podcast is a series of discussions on chapters of the Bhagavata Purana, a classic text of Vaishnava philosophy, sacred law, and profound ritual traditions. Thank you for joining us for the Bhagavata Podcast. Narayanam namaskritya naram chaiva narottamam devim saraswatim vyasam tato jayamudiraye. Welcome, Radhika Raman Prabhu. I'm very honored and happy to have you again on this podcast. We have reached now the 9th chapter of the Srimad Bhagavatam. I guess we could call this one of the Mahabharata style chapters. The Bhagavatam has picked up the story of what happens after the Mahabharata war, and something dramatic is going to happen in this chapter. Do you want to give us a bit of an overview of it?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Very happy to be back with you, Bhrigupada Prabhu, and looking forward to discussing this particular chapter, which is one of my favorites. I worry that I've said that about multiple chapters now, so it starts to lose its force, but it is genuine. This chapter is quite beautiful in its content and in the way that it moves along the storyline in the first canto of Bhagavatam. So this continues the scene from the last chapter about which is describing the grief of the Pandavas after the end of the Mahabharata war. So that's how the previous chapter began, is describing their grief, and this chapter begins with that as well. Maharaj Yudhishthira, as well as the other Pandavas, Draupadi, they're all devastated by the fact that this battle has taken away most of their relatives and their friends and caused immense bloodshed for their family members. And they're trying to find ways of coping with that grief. In the previous chapter, Krishna was ready to leave back to Dwarka after the end of the battle. And he is stopped first by Uttara, when Ashwatthama sends his Brahmastra weapon to kill the last heir of the Pandavas, Maharaj Parikshit. And then he is stopped by Queen Kunti, who offers beautiful prayers in chapter 8. And then he is again stopped by King Yudhishthira, who is inconsolable when it comes to his grief. And so this chapter then continues with that. And Krishna, instead of giving lengthy advice to King Yudhishthira, rather accompanies him to the place where Bhishmadeva, the great grandsire of the dynasty that has now in shambles, Bhishmadeva is lying on a bed of arrows, waiting for the conclusion of the battle, the coronation of King Yudhishthira. And now that has happened, he's waiting to leave his body. He's waiting to die. And so this chapter is really focused on a few different themes. One is the presence of suffering and grief in our lives, even in the lives of those who are good and righteous, like the Pandavas. It is focused on what it means to die a good death. What is the good death? And in fact, later tradition regards this chapter as paradigmatic in the matter of dying. Whenever the good death is put forward, whenever it's put forward, whenever we're looking for an exemplar of what it means to die well, Bhishmadeva's story emerges as an example of that. So this chapter overall, I think, is essential. It's meaningful for these several reasons within the tradition itself. So just in terms of the plot, Arjun and Krishna are seated on the same chariot, and they are accompanied by Maharaj Yudhishthira. There are also a few sages that are going with them, and they're all proceeding to the place where Bhishmadeva is lying on a bed of arrows. And he is, of course, near the end of his life. And as they arrive there, the Pandavas break down in tears, and they're crying, they're sobbing, and Bhishmadeva is as well. He also is. He feels the gravity of the moment, and he particularly feels the pain of the Pandavas. There are his family and his beloved great-grandchildren, and so he begins to console them. As he's consoling him, King Yudhishthira in particular, he's trying to refocus his intention on the task ahead, rather than allowing him to grieve only for what has passed, which has been terrible, of course. But he's trying to refocus him on his duty ahead, in the way that Krishna attempts to refocus Arjun's attention when he is also overcome by grief before the battle happens, thinking about the consequences of the battle. Krishna says, focus on your duty, what you need to do. So Bhishmadeva is now functioning in a similar way for Maharaj Yudhishthira, saying, you're looking back, now let's focus on what is to come forward. You have a huge task ahead of you, which is to rule this kingdom, this vast kingdom of yours. And here's how you should do it. So there's this point where he offers instructions in dharma, which are elaborated, of course, extensively in the Mahabharata. I mean, there's a huge section focused on this. But here, only in just a few verses, where the Bhagavatam doesn't actually provide us with the instructions, but says simply that he talked about this topic and this topic and this topic. And after that, once he's done, he focuses his attention on Krishna. He is done with helping the world. Bhishma has lived a very long life of caring for others, of sacrificing his own needs for the benefit of others, for the kingdom, for the family. And now it's time for him to focus upon himself and his own further journey. And so he looks at Krishna. He offers a series of beautiful prayers to Krishna that are just gorgeous, every one of them, in terms of their language, in terms of their imagery. And then he departs the world. He waits for an auspicious time and departs this world. And the chapter ends with the Pandavas performing funeral rites for their departed grandfather, and then turning their attention to ruling. That's the summary in a nutshell.
Thank you. That was an excellent summary. There's so many interesting themes to pick up on in this chapter. Just like you, this is for me also one of my favorite chapters. And I remember as a young boy reading this chapter for the first time, what an impression it left on me. We always call him Grandfather Bhishma, but to Arjuna he's something like great grand uncle or something like that, isn't it?
Yeah.
But anyway, he's the patriarch of the family, of the whole Kaurava clan. And now he's lying there on the bed of arrows, which doesn't really do the word doesn't do justice to the situation. He's pierced by innumerable arrows. And my first question on this chapter is there's grief involved in this chapter, as you mentioned, so perceptibly. But they don't seem to be showing any remorse for the fact that it is the Pandavas and Arjuna who actually put him in this situation.
That's a very perceptive observation. There is plenty of remorse for the battle itself and everything that has transpired, which Maharaj Yudhishthira feels really was caused by him. And we may have discussed this last time, but some scholars argue that the Mahabharata, despite its extensive descriptions of bloodshed in the battles, various battle scenes, but especially the Battle of Kurukshetra, or perhaps because of its extensive descriptions, is actually arguing for the futility of war rather than glorifying it, the larger argument. And that certainly seems to emerge in this and the previous chapter of the Bhagavatam, where there's a very clear sense of remorse on Yudhishthira's part and the Pandavas for what has happened, which they feel that has happened on their account. And yet, as you point out, there doesn't seem to be particular remorse or an attempt at apology for the fact that they have put their grandfather in this rather painful situation. I mean, I guess one could speculate on multiple reasons why that might be the case. But I think one thing that should be taken into account is the spirit of the Kshatriyas, the warriors who see it as a normal circumstance of events, or even their duty to fight valiantly and to the death with whomever comes before them in a fighting spirit. And because Bhishma was on the other side of the battle, there was no question that he would be a target, even as there was no question that the Pandavas would be a target for Bhishma. In fact, at some point in the battle, Duryodhan comes to Bhishma and says, "You are being easy on the Pandavas because they are your favorites." And Bhishma takes great offense to this accusation. He doesn't say, "Well, yes, of course, what do you expect? I love them." Love or no love, relationships aside, at the moment of battle, there is one thing to put forward, which is to fight with all one's might for victory as a matter of duty, right? So neither Bhishma nor the Pandavas seem to hold any regret for the particular encounter that they found themselves in once they had committed to war. The commitment to war itself is, I think, the matter of remorse here, is why did we go down this path anyhow, and what good has come of it now?
Thank you. I think this is very, very true what you're saying, and we can also see this reflected, I think, to some extent in the prayers that Bhishma is going to offer Krishna later in this chapter. For a modern reader such as me, it's not always so easy to appreciate some of the imagery of the Bhagavatam, especially this kind of mix of love and violence, and kind of beautiful violence. We will see that plenty of that later on in Krishna Lila, for example, how he is killing the demons and their brains are oozing out and so on. and even here we'll see this kind of mix of blood and love, which can be a little bit disturbing to modern sensibilities. Is this something you'd like to comment on?
Yeah, I think this is such an astute observation on your part. It's a very odd combination, a very incongruous combination, and yet at the same time, are they not flip sides of the same coin? Means the greatest types of anger and battle and violence emerge against those whom we care for or care about the most, right? Some random person who is doing something wrong, I may feel upset in a general sense. How could they? do such a thing. But for those who are close, that anger becomes very personal. And I think the Mahabharata war is an example of that. It's particularly violent because these are people who know each other too well, and therefore they know exactly how to give pain to one another in battle, right? And so we know this in our relationships. Hopefully they are not physically painful, but on an emotional level, the closer, the more you love someone, the more capacity you have to give them pain. And this is one of the paradoxical realities of love in this world, and what makes love such a wonderful thing and also such a dangerous thing, right? Love is dangerous because it gives one access to another person that comes with it comes great responsibility, because one's now ability to uplift that person is so much greater, and one's ability to drag them down is so much greater. So I think the Bhagavatam is really kind of, it demonstrates that combination, particularly as we'll see in some of Bhishma's prayers to Krishna in this chapter. It becomes very indistinguishable at one point as to when he's fighting Krishna and drawing blood, and when he's showering him with affection. What exactly? How are those two things different? Because in the moment, they're actually, those feelings are overlapping, and the commentators point this out very, very nicely. There's also the element, I should mention, that in Krishna, love and violence come together particularly, right? So sanghara and uddhara are the same things when it comes to Krishna. His destruction and his liberation are the same. This is not true of ordinary humans, but for Krishna in particular, the Bhagavatam is very emphatic on multiple occasions that when Krishna destroys, he liberates. Because by contact with him, he relieves people, especially those who are evil or sinful or harmful to the world. He, in the process of subduing them, he is not only benefiting those who are now protected by the violence they bring, but he is also uplifting the person whom he has subdued by giving them an opportunity for liberation, actually, and for a new beginning.
Thank you. You mentioned before that this chapter is bringing together a whole chunk of the Mahabharata, and I think we're actually speaking about hundreds of chapters in the Mahabharata. It's all of the Shanti Parva and the Anushasana Parva. Two of the books of the Mahabharata are condensed into a few verses here, and all of the teachings, I think the Bhagavatam summarizes into saying that Bhishma is teaching about both Vairagya and about Raga, about detachment and attachment. Detachment from bad things, attachment to the divine. But this chapter doesn't only summarize all of those hundreds of teachings of the Mahabharata. I remember when I read the Mahabharata, the unabridged version, many of the chapters here were quite exciting because it's so much detail about political life and so on, but it's also many chapters that are quite repetitive with what will happen if you give a donation of silver, what will happen if you give a donation of gold, what will happen if you give a donation of land, and so on. So we have a summary of all of that, but then the retelling of this story also does other things. It downplays the fact that Bhishma is waiting for a particular time to die, and rather it emphasizes Krishna's presence, and then in that way also giving emphasis to Bhishma's prayers. But it also has a very interesting section at towards the middle of the chapter, when Bhishma is welcoming the Pandavas and offering them some words of consolation. And those are very interesting and important verses, because they speak, of course, about what you mentioned just at the beginning. Why do bad things happen to good people? Why do good people have to suffer in this world? Would you like to speak a little bit on that?
Yes, I want to just reflect on one thing that you brought up, which is the fact that so many hundreds of chapters are summarized in just maybe 3 or 4 verses. Hundreds of chapters from the Mahabharata are summarized by the Bhagavatam in 3 to 4 verses. I think this is one thing that also demonstrates the Bhagavatam's priorities, its own priorities in terms of when the Bhagavata is retelling stories that are well known from other texts, I think those are particularly useful moments for us to reflect on what is the Bhagavata actually trying to do. Because you only retell a story if there's something new you want to do with it, right? One can assume that readers already know the Ramayana, yet, and the Bhagavata makes it clear. Shukadev Goswami says to King Parikshit, he says, you've already heard this story many times, so I will tell you in brief only. And then it's interesting to see what things he tells and what things he leaves out, because they reflect on the text priorities. And here it's interesting because the teachings on dharma and so on are summarized very briefly. And they're not even actually, the teachings are not provided. It's only said that he does teach on these topics without relaying the content of the teaching. And yet the Bhagavata spends comparatively a long time, relatively, it spends a long time describing the prayers, the verses of praise that Bhishmadeva offers to Krishna, that reflect on their relationship as was expressed in the battle of Kurukshetra. The text spends a lot more time talking about these Bhishma's relationship to the Pandavas as reflected in the words of welcome that he provides, and the sharing in their sorrow, his personal acknowledgement of the pain that they're in. So I just want to point out that the priorities of the Bhagavata are very clear in this chapter by its focus on relationship. The relational aspects of this episode, Bhishma's relationship with Krishna, Bhishma's relationship with the Pandavas' relationship with Bhishma, those emerge front and center. And I mention this only because this is not something unique to this chapter. The Bhagavata does this over and over again. It sidelines plot, it sidelines even teachings sometimes to focus on relationship. And it certainly demonstrates those priorities here in retelling this section of the Mahabharata, which, as you point out, is massive. And it would be unusual for any reader of the Bhagavatam to be unaware, at least in general terms, of that huge section in the Mahabharata. So, yeah. But that didn't answer your question, did it?
That's okay. We can get back to that. For me, it's also quite interesting to read Srila Prabhupada's purports to this chapter, because in general, I find the first canto quite different from the way that Prabhupada comments on the Bhagavatam later. He has many more things to say about social life in the first canto than he does later. And this chapter is a good example of that. He will comment on his vision of a just society, his vision for good leaders, even good military leaders. So he clearly is inspired by the teachings that Bhishma gives to the Pandavas, and that he will have read about elsewhere. There's also another thing that I found, I remember as a young boy, I found quite fascinating about this chapter. And the beginning of the chapter is how the Bhagavatam mentions all these sages who were present. That there's
Yes.
A whole list of different sages. And in the purport, Prabhupada provides a short biography for all of them, or almost all of them. And as a young boy reading this chapter, I realized this book is amazing. I don't know if I mentioned it to you before, but in that age and still today, I loved the writings of Tolkien.
I didn't know
Lord of
that.
the Rings, and the way that he kind of creates a whole world full of characters and places, and if there's a name, you know that there's some story behind the name. But when I read the Srimad Bhagavatam for the first time, I realized this is a world inconceivably more rich and deep. That all these persons who are just given by name once here, Pulaha, Kratu, Angiras, and so on, Prabhupada gives us a short introduction to these persons, and you realize you can spend a whole lifetime researching just a few of these persons and see how their stories are woven in the Mahabharata and in the Puranas. So that's something I really appreciated, that Prabhupada is giving us a window into this amazing world of ancient India.
Yes, and his commentaries on this first canto, as you pointed out, are yeah, they're different in multiple ways. I think he's focused a lot more on social commentary, and he's also more extensive in his commentaries than he is later on in the Bhagavatam. He's also speaking. He's not assuming any knowledge of the theology or the cultural context of the Bhagavatam. And I think one really sees, if we think back to the context of Prabhupada's own writing of the first canto, he's in India and he's preparing for his mission to the West. And as a result, he's really writing in a way that is conscious of the social environment in the world at the time, the political environment in the world at the time. He's also, as we see in the preface to the Bhagavatam, where he directly references the rise of communism, for example, and the desire for unity in the world and a sense of spirit of equality that's present. He also directly references the advancements of science and of implicitly of the increased global cooperation between nations in the world. So all of that context is very much present in this first canto, as he's writing not just for a group of followers, not just even for his sampradaya. He's very much focused on writing for a global audience, an audience that is that is operating in an ever more globalized world, and that does not necessarily know anything about Bhagavata culture, right? So you see all of that packed in. And if I might add, there's also another concern, I think, which is present, which is that he doesn't know how much time he has to complete the Bhagavata. And so he's really trying to put as much as he can in the first and the second cantos. So this commentary really does stand out, I think, and this chapter is a good example of all of these priorities for Srila Prabhupada.
So what does Bhishma say when the Pandavas come?
Yes. Okay, back to your original question. He can, first of all, he sees that they're grieving. And the grief is born of the fact that this battle has happened, which has, of course, torn away their family from them through massive amounts of death and violence. But also, I think that grief is wrapped up in everything that they have been through in this process. It has been a very physically and emotionally wrenching journey for the Pandavas, as they have been under attack by the Kauravas, by their cousins for a lifetime now. And they've been through so much in that process. We saw some of that in the prayers of Queen Kunti, who lists some of the ways in which she is, some of the experiences that she has been through with her sons. So I think all of that pain and all of that grief is present in the moment. It's present to Bhishmadeva, and he acknowledges that first with his own tears, first by sharing in their grief, which is very important. There's empathy there. And I should point out that sharing in their grief comes before the teaching. For someone who's grieving, if you simply show up and offer them instruction as to how they can overcome it, it's rarely effective. There has to be some sense of empathy there, that I am present with you in this moment of pain. And so we see that when the Pandavas arrive, that Bhishmadeva is first just present with them in that grief, and then he empathizes by expressing how he feels for them. He says, to quote Prabhupada's translation here, "What terrible sufferings and what terrible injustices you good souls suffer for being the sons of religion personified. You did not deserve to remain alive under those tribulations, yet you were protected by the Brahmins, God, and religion. As far as my daughter-in-law Kunti is concerned, she became a widow with many children, and therefore she suffered greatly." And so he says, this is terrible what you went through. This is not, you did not deserve to go through all this. And it was the most unlikely thing that you even survived it. Anyone else would have died in the circumstances that you had to go through. So he shares in their pain. He empathizes first. And then he tries to make sense of it. Right? This is so natural, such a normal, such a good way to address circumstances of grief. Is he shares in their grief first, he understands their pain, and then, like all of us in moments of grief, he tries to make sense of it. He says, why has this happened? And he says, particularly because you are, Dharma Putra, you are Dharma Sutta, you're the son of Dharma itself. This is Yudhishthira's origin, right? He's not only the son of Pandu, he's the son of Dharmaraj. And so throughout his life, the Pandavas in general have tried to live by the principles of righteousness. And yet, you've had to go through so much. Why? Why is it the case? And he offers a variety of options, but one of the things he says I like very much. He says, in my opinion, this is all due to inevitable time, under whose control everyone in every planet is carried, just as clouds are carried by the wind, right? So there's this sense of maybe we don't need to explain it. Maybe the process of trying to say, this happened because of this, and this happened because of that, and I could have done this differently, that sense of, I could have done this, I could have done that. Maybe that's not very useful in this moment. Maybe we need to recognize that this world is just not set up to be a perfect place. And I think this is a key point of the Bhagavata's theodicy. It shows up many, many times. The Bhagavata's approach to the problem of evil, the problem of human suffering, is, or in layman's terms, why do bad things happen to good people? Right? Is this reliance on time, which I think is a reliance on the general acknowledgement that this world was never promised to be a good place. It will not be. There's no point at which it's going to become a beautiful, transformed world. It's the nature of this world is one that is infused with misery and with joy, but it's always going to be a mixture of the two. And so it is the force of time, he says. That's one of his explanations.
Yeah. I find this reference to time here to be quite fascinating and thought-provoking. I suppose time here could be understood in something like the sense of providence, of a kind of impersonal fate or something like that. There's writing about the power of time already in the Atharva Veda, I think. And of course in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna famously identifies himself with time in the 11th chapter. I am time come to destroy the worlds. Kala. But why Kala instead of something like karma? That would be a kind of a cosmology that we would be more familiar with. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yes, it's a wonderful observation, and I think the Bhagavata, of course, focuses on karma in many, many places as a very important factor in how things take place in this world. And yet here, the focus on karma would be counterproductive. The Pandavas are grieving because they're feeling the weight of responsibility. The word karma just means action. And blaming the situation on their actions is something that doesn't need to be done because they're already doing it for themselves, right? So instead, he's trying to point away from them and say, you have to recognize, my grandsons, you have to recognize that there are factors in this whole scenario that are well beyond your control, right? And I think this is a useful practice in situations where we are already feeling great remorse and great sense of responsibilities to recognize, yes, I did something, but no, I was not the only factor in making this happen. We have choices to make along the way, but certainly we are not responsible for the overall circumstances in which we operate. Those are products of a much larger universe of activity, of hundreds, thousands of souls who come together to act out their karma. And, tellingly, he says, also the will of Krishna. So he begins by this rather impersonal force of saying, look, the world is like this, time is like this. We all end up being forced to act because we have to respond to a situation. And you can't blame yourself when something terrible happens. You can't blame yourself for responding in the best possible way that you can think of in that moment. That circumstance was not only created by you. So he offers a generic sense of, kala, time is very powerful, the circumstances are powerful. But then in classic Bhagavata style, he personalizes it, right? And kala moves from being a generic force in the world to being the will of Krishna himself, to being a way through which Krishna acts. So just 2 verses later he says, no one can know the plan of the Lord. Even though great philosophers inquire exhaustively, they are bewildered, right? So again, this emphasis on stop taking the full burden of responsibility on yourself. It will destroy you. And recognize that there are so many factors at play. And most importantly, this person who's standing here right before us, Krishna, ultimately it's all his plan. And we are unable to recognize the wishes, the desires of Krishna as he acts in this world.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Later on in the Bhagavata, Bhishma will be called one of the 12 Mahajanas, one of 12 great beings. So his words definitely carry a lot of weight. And one thing I realized while you were speaking about this is that it could be seen as a kind of trying to get rid of your own personal responsibility by referring to providence or time or something like that. But as you so perceptively say, Bhishma is not trying to get out of his own responsibility. He's trying to tell the Pandavas that they are not only responsible. So he is kind of on the losing side. He could blame the Pandavas for everything that happened, but he doesn't want to do that. He wants to console them, and I think that speaks very highly about his qualities also as a truly great personality. He's great not only in terms of his military prowess or his age or something like that, but through his wisdom. And as you say, the Bhagavatam here then goes into describing or letting Bhishma say something about Krishna. And after this, we will then hear in a few verses his teachings, and we spoke a little bit about that. And then from verse 32, Bhishma then starts to offer his prayers to Krishna. Would you like to say something about these prayers? Maybe you have a favorite one among them.
Oh yes, I would love to say something about this. Just for the benefit of our listeners, I want to just add one thing to our discussion of the problem of evil earlier. There's a very good chapter, an excellent chapter describing the Bhagavata's response to the problem of suffering in this world, with particular reference to this chapter in the Bhagavatam, the Bhishmadeva episode, that is written by my brother, Gopal Gupta, and found in an edited volume that was brought together by Kenneth Valpey and myself. It's called the Bhagavata Purana, Sacred Text and Living Tradition. And in this chapter called May Calamities Befall Us at Every Step, Gopal focuses on the previous chapter, Queen Kunti's her prayers to Krishna that address her own suffering, and then this chapter where Bhishma addresses the suffering of the Pandavas. And this verse in particular, where where Bhishma points to Krishna as the cause, Krishna's will as the cause, as the ultimate cause of suffering. There's a wonderful commentary by Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, which I want to read for you, where this is that verse I mentioned earlier where Bhishma says, "No one can know the plan of the Lord, even though philosophers inquire, they are bewildered." So to this, Vishwanath says, "Inquiry is necessary. Does God want to give us suffering? Does he want to give us joy? Does he want to give us suffering and joy? It cannot be the first option," he says, and namely that God wants to give us suffering, because his quality of being affectionate to his devotee would be cancelled. It cannot be the second option, which is, does he want to give us joy? Because we have not seen any happiness. So blunt he is. He says, if Krishna wanted to give us joy, where is it? Life is too much trouble. And then he says, it cannot be the third option, because that would be a contradiction to his kind nature, that he wants to give both happiness and suffering. It is finally decided that no one can solve the problem by inquiry. And yet he begins this by saying inquiry is necessary. So I think this is where so many theodicies, so many attempts to address the problem of evil end up in multiple traditions. is an acknowledgement that while we can make sense of many things in this world, some things are beyond our capacity to make sense of, and we have to leave them to God's design and His will. So that's kind of the point at which that discussion of theodicy ends up. Bhishma attempts to explain it because inquiry is necessary, but then in the end says some things we cannot solve by inquiry because Krishna's will is inscrutable. Okay, so I wanted to mention that because I find that chapter, that reading, quite useful. But going back now to your to the next section of the chapter and to your question, namely Bhishma's prayers to Krishna. So as I was mentioning earlier, at some point Bhishma recognizes that his giving to the world is now come to a close. He has the capacity, the boon for ichha mrityu, meaning he can die when he wills. And he has now made a decision that his work in this world is done and it is time to leave. And in that moment, he is focusing his mental and emotional and devotional energies on Krishna and describing the vision of Krishna that is dearest to him. And that vision of Krishna, he describes many things. He describes Krishna in his four-handed form as Vishnu. He describes Krishna even in Vrindavan in his dancing with the gopis. And I find this very striking because it again, from a textual level, it demonstrates the Bhagavatam's infatuation with Krishna's Vrindavan Leela. We saw it come up in the prayers of Queen Kunti, did we not? When she mentions Krishna's Braj Leela and the Damodar Leela, we see this come up with Uddhav in Canto 3. We see it in Bhishmadeva, whose relationship with Krishna is not at all in the mood of Braj, and especially not in the mood of the gopis. And yet even he praises, it's just a verse, but he takes a moment to acknowledge that there's something special about Vrindavan. Right? And this is the Bhagavatam again signaling that there is a great reward coming at the end of this book, something sweeter than the sweetest, which will yet arrive. So he describes Krishna as the four-handed form. He describes Krishna dancing with the gopis, and yet he settles. He spends the most time. He focuses his mind and attention on that form of Krishna that he so admires. And this is as Arjuna Sakha, as Parthasarathi, where he describes in great detail a few moments, a few instances from the battle of Kurukshetra. First, he describes the scene. Krishna is sitting in front of Arjun on the chariot as his charioteer, and he has the whip for the horses in his right hand. He has the bridle, the reins, in his left. And his hair is ashen due to the dust that has been kicked up by the hooves of the horses. The charioteer is right there next to, on a much lower platform, closer to the horses than the charioteer, than the fighter, the warrior is. So he describes that beautiful scene. And one of the things I really love about that description is that actually in the commentary, Prabhupada says something that I really I appreciate very much. He says that this vision of Krishna as Parthasarathi was not accessible even to Arjun because he was part of it. He was behind Krishna. This vision was particularly for Bhishma's pleasure. So he and there's this place in the 10th canto where Sanatana Goswami in his commentary, he says something quite striking. He says that Krishna manifests a specific quality for every devotee. And because every devotee is unique in their relationship with Krishna, therefore Krishna creates in their personalities also, Krishna creates a unique quality specifically for that bhakta, which means that because the numbers of bhaktas are unlimited, Krishna's qualities are unlimited, right? I mean, what an expansive understanding of Krishna here as the embodiment of all rasa, that he's got something unique for every devotee. And we see that in this verse for Bhishma, where Krishna manifests this particular mode of relationship with him, which is that mode of love in the context of war, right? That you highlighted earlier. This is such an awkward moment. And yet, even as Bhishma is being attacked, and he is attacking, he is in the throes of affection, of love for Krishna, admiring this scene of Krishna as Parthasarathi. The scene develops, it continues, of him describing how when he shot arrows at Krishna, he drew blood. He pierced Krishna's armor and drew blood. And Prabhupada, following his commentary, Prabhupada's commentary follows Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur very closely in these verses. And Vishwanath Chakravarti says that this felt to Krishna like the lover's bite. When the lover bites the beloved and even sometimes causes some pain, this is the greatest form of happiness, right? And then after those arrows draw blood and Arjun is being attacked particularly, and his life is in danger, Bhishma, his plan all along comes to fruition, which is that Krishna has to break his promise, and he runs to Bhishma. Again, Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says, as a lover runs to their beloved, right? Krishna is running to Bhishma in anger that is mixed with love, picks up the wheel of a chariot and decides to kill him. And Bhishma throws down his weapons, opens his arms wide and says, "Come, Krishna, come to my arms," which is, of course, the sign for both surrender in battle and embrace between lovers, right? So again, this is I think your comment earlier is so relevant because it's such an incredible combination of love in battle. This is described as virya rasa in Rasa Shastra, love that is expressed, relationship that is expressed through a sense of chivalry. So I'll just say one more thing about this, which is what is striking to me in Bhishmadev's descriptions of these of this scene in his prayers, the Parthasarathi scene, the scene of Krishna running towards him to attack him, is the detail with which he describes it. He mentions, for example, the fact that Krishna dropped his uttariya, his upper garment, his shawl, on the way as he's running towards him. He mentions the fact that his hair is covered by dust from the hooves. He tells us which hand is holding which thing, right? And I find this quite striking because perhaps you've had this experience, I have myself, is that when there are moments in your life that are defining moments, moments that shape who you are, we remember the most incredible details as if it was yesterday. That the mind takes a picture that is much more detailed than the regular events of our life. I remember, for example, the first time I heard the voice of Chaitanya, my oldest child, when he was born, right? The sound of his first cry and the feeling of holding him after he was born, it's impressed on me in a way that I can never forget, right? I can still see, hear, smell everything about that scene, every fine detail. Why? Because that scene was something that was a momentous occasion for me in my life. It shaped who I am. It made me who I am today in so many ways, right? The birth of a child. So Bhishmadeva seems to be going through, remembering something similar, right? These are moments that for him represented the pinnacle of his relationship with Krishna, and he has them picture perfect in his mind. He can tell us where Krishna's sash, his cloth was in that moment, what happened, as if it was yesterday.
Wow, that's amazing. That's beautiful. And it's amazing also to think about this in relationship to who Bhishma is. Bhagavatam presents him as the warrior from 1,000 battlefields and so on. So he's really this larger than life character who has lived a very, very long life. I forget how long, but probably like a few hundreds of years. And gone through all these different adventures, some of them quite shocking and traumatic for him as well and for other people involved. So for him to remember this particular scene in so great clarity and such detail really says something about what is central for him in the Bhagavata version of this story. Another thing that I love about that scene, which of course for me, when I think about that scene, I'm thinking of the BBT painting of him really standing like this, welcoming Krishna coming with the wheel and so on in his hand. And one very beautiful aspect of that whole encounter, of course, is that Krishna is prepared to break his own word. He had promised not to fight in the battle, and Bhishma forces him to almost do so. Then the conch is blown to signal the end of the day's fighting, so he doesn't actually attack Bhishma in the end, but he's prepared to do so. He's prepared to break his own word out of love for his devotee Arjuna. And to me, that's such a beautiful thing that speaks about, again, as you say, about relationships. That's something that almost happens at the end of the Gita as well, when Krishna says to Arjuna that now I've told you everything there is to say, now you do as you will. So he's giving him his free choice, but then immediately goes on speaking. But listen to this final teaching, man mana bhava man bhakto, and so on. So he's kind of almost infringing on the free will of the jiva, but out of love. So his love for his devotees is overriding everything else. And here with Bhishma, it's overriding his own promise. I'm not going to fight. So there's plenty of things going on in these few seconds in the whole 18-day battle.
Yes, and this also ties back to our earlier discussion of the problem of suffering, because it points to the fact that while externally there may be conflict and pain in a particular situation, one does not know internally what is happening, or relationally what is happening between Krishna and the devotee, right? So from an outward perception, it seems a moment of conflict between Krishna and Bhishma. The two are attacking each other. They're preparing to kill each other. And yet, internally, this is a moment of great love and affection between them. And so, even in moments of challenge and trouble, one doesn't know the layers that are taking place. There's an outward element, and then there's an internal element, particularly in the relationship between Krishna and his devotee in a moment of suffering or even conflict that is there. And so Bhishma, Arjun may see this. Arjun did see this as a moment of conflict. He runs to prevent Krishna from breaking his promise, to prevent him from killing Bhishma. But for Bhishma, this is not a moment of conflict at all. It is the moment that it's the culmination of his relationship with Krishna, the very moment he's been waiting for, where he has successfully shown to the world that Krishna is willing to do anything for the purpose of his devotee, to protect his devotee.
There's one more thing I want to touch on here, and I'm a little bit hesitant, but because it might be a bit controversial, but I'll go ahead anyway. You described beautifully Bhishma's feelings for Krishna and drawing on what Vishwanath Chakravarti and then Prabhupada writes. There's almost like an erotic element to it. This erotic in a kind of ancient Indian, more kind of physical way, with drawing of blood and so on, which people who have read Kama Shastra will recognize as being part of lovemaking in ancient India. Could we say that there's a bit of homoeroticism going on here?
I think there are those who would interpret it as such. There has been scholarship on Indian traditions that has highlighted or argued for such aspects, and as you mentioned, such scholarship has been immensely controversial. Particularly, I think members of Hindu traditions have often taken offense at the interpretive lens of homoeroticism being used by scholars. So certainly one could look at it that way. I think from a theological perspective, with the Bhagavata's vision of every devotee, regardless of gender, being having the capacity for a relationship with Krishna that is one of love in many different forms, right? Whether we think of the Vatsalya, the parental love that Kunti highlighted in the previous chapter, or we think of the love of the gopis that Bhishma is mentioning in this chapter. Those sorts of relationships are open and available to every person, regardless of their gender in this body itself, with Krishna being seen as the Purusha, the Purushottama, the ultimate center of all love and of all relationship. So that element is there. I think for the commentators, Bhishma is not within that mode of erotic relationship with Krishna. His relationship with Krishna is specified by Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur as being in generically dasya rasa, the mode of service to Krishna as a master and servant, but with the particular inflection of the secondary rasa of virya or chivalry. That is a mode in which a servant can serve their master, is in a chivalrous mode. And the battle is an example of that chivalry. So I think Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur and Prabhupada following him are offering the erotic imagery as an analogy or as a metaphor for the way in which love is expressed even in counterintuitive ways, right? So even as two lovers during lovemaking may bite one another and cause pain or draw blood, so also in this relationship, which is dasya mixed with virya, love is expressed in ways that externally appear to be painful, right? So I think they're primarily here drawing an analogy in using the paradigmatic, the highest of all rasas, right? The adi rasa, or the culmination of rasa, the ujvala rasa, which for Gaudiya Vaishnavas is the highest rasa, the most vibrant, beautiful of them, is the rasa of Shringara or Madhurya, that is, of amorous love between the Lord and the devotee, using that paradigmatic love and drawing an analogy from it to the type of love being expressed by Bhishma for Krishna, which is not in that amorous mode, but nevertheless demonstrates elements of love that is expressed in even some painful ways.
Thank you. You began by saying that one of the things that you said in the beginning was that Bhishma becomes like a paradigm for how to die. And much of the Srimad Bhagavata, of course, is about dying, like in Rick Jarrow's book Tales for the Dying that I mentioned earlier on this podcast. He dies, of course, after offering these prayers. Do you want to say something more on that topic before we end for today?
Yes. In so many ways, Bhishmadeva is an exemplar. And as you mentioned, he's one of the 12 Mahajans. And these 12 great personalities that the Bhagavata singles out as being exemplars of Dharma. And one of the ways in which he is an exemplar is his demonstration of the good death, right? And there's a few elements here that I think are paradigmatic. The most important being his focus on Krishna, withdrawing his mind from all other things. So as you mentioned, he's called Sahasrani, one who has done 1,000 things, 1,000 battlefields, he's given 1,000 speeches, he's worked through 1,000 diplomatic situations. So he's really done a lot. And for someone like him, the mind doing many things at once is quite a common occurrence. So the Bhagavatam specifically mentions that he stops that and focuses his mind very specifically on Krishna, withdrawing it from the world outside. So that is paradigmatic about how one ought to die. The other thing is that he chooses a particular moment to die, right? There's an element of yogic death here as well, of the yogi being able to say, this is when I want to die, because this is most conducive to a better future, a better next life. And he waits until the sun moves into Uttarayana, or it moves into the longer days of the year begin, right? Where it's in its northern course. He waits for that moment. He also passes away after giving instruction to others. He is teaching as he is dying, and this is also an element of the good death. Is that the person who dies not only for themselves, but dies for the world, in teaching them how to die, in teaching them how to let go of attachment, vairagya. As you mentioned, vairagya and raga, right? At the beginning of this session, you mentioned how he's detaching himself, he's withdrawing himself, but he's also attaching himself to Krishna. And in that juxtaposition of vairagya and raga, he is offering instruction or teaching. In the case of Bhishma, quite explicitly he's teaching, but also he's teaching through his behavior in the way that he is passing away. And because the death is so exemplary, therefore all the sages appear as well, and to be present, and that their presence has a dual role. They are there to learn by observation. We learn how to die by observing how others die, and this is so central to the Bhagavata's culture, right? Death is not something that is hidden away, either the moments before or the moments after death. It is not something that's hidden away for fear that it might offend or hurt or disgust someone. It is something that is to be observed, because especially the moments leading to death, because we can learn how to die by watching someone die well. So the sages are there to learn. They're also there to give him confidence, to give him support, because it's a journey. It's a frightening journey. It's a journey of great change, even if it's not one of fear. It's a moment of great change. And having people who can offer support and offer wisdom in that moment is wonderful. And so even before Bhishma starts his teaching, even before he starts his prayers in this chapter, so there's quite some time. Remember, he's speaking hundreds of chapters worth of teachings. He puts in one request, and it's something that one can easily miss, but he says, he turns to Krishna and he says, please stay here till I pass away, right? So he's saying, I have some work to do. I have to teach. I have to prepare myself, but don't leave before the end. I want you at the last moment here, right? And that is the devotee's ultimate prayer, right? This is the prayer expressed in the Isha Upanishad, all the way back in the Upanishads. It's the devotees praying, just be there at the moment of my death. Remember me then, right? Like I've spent all this life with you. Don't abandon me when I need you most. And so Bhishma, in a very personal way, he requests that of Krishna. And Krishna obliges. He stays there till the very end. In fact, until his funeral rites are completed.
I find it also very, very beautiful how the passing itself is described, and how when he actually passes, everyone goes silent. There's this moment of deep silence, and then there are these celestial drums and flowers raining down from heaven. So there's this kind of jubilation, but before that, it's just like this.
Yes.
And then, so it's really, really a dramatic chapter. Thank you so much for reading this chapter and going through this chapter with us. As always, I'm in great awe of your way of summarizing and really bringing out the relevance of these Bhagavatam chapters. So thank you very much for taking the time to discuss the chapter with us here, and I hope to see you on many more episodes in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bhrigupada Prabhu. It's always a joy. It really is. And these insights really emerge in the course of conversation. I very much appreciate your insights as well. And I have a feeling that I will not be able to stay away for too much longer. So thank you.